October 27, 2008, a Sunday morning. Across 66 stores in 20 states, employees arrived for their shifts and found a single sheet of paper posted on the bulletin board. All stores closing. Everything must go. No press conference, no farewell speech, just a bankruptcy filing and a liquidator's contract. But this wasn't just any retail chain. At its peak, Value City was an empire. 113 stores, nearly $1 billion in annual revenue, a name that 3 generations of working-class Americans trusted for clothes, shoes, and household goods at prices they could actually afford. It had survived the Great Depression, survived World War II, survived every recession the 20th century could throw at it. 91 years, 3 generations of one family, gone in 9 months. How does a chain that outlasted everything, outlasted wars, recessions, and the collapse of American manufacturing, get destroyed by a couple of big box stores selling the exact same promise it built its entire identity on? The answer isn't the 2008 financial crisis. The answer started in 1962, the year Walmart opened its first store. Value City Department Stores, Columbus, Ohio, 1917 to 2008. Ephraim Schottenstein didn't arrive in America with a business plan. He arrived with a suitcase, a work ethic, and one idea that would define everything that came after. Find what people need, find it cheaper than anyone else, and get it to them before someone else does. He was a Lithuanian immigrant, part of the wave of Eastern European Jews who came to the United States in the early 20th century, looking for something simpler than survival. He settled in Columbus, Ohio, not New York, not Chicago, a mid-sized Midwestern city built on manufacturing, agriculture, and the kind of steady, unglamorous labor that keeps a country running. Columbus wasn't a place where fortunes were made overnight. It was a place where fortunes were built slowly, by people who showed up every single day. Ephraim started as a traveling salesman. He moved goods from town to town, buying what merchants didn't want and selling it to people who did. No storefronts, no overhead, no safety net, just product, price, and persistence. In 1917, he opened his first permanent store at 1887 Parsons Avenue, a corner lot at the intersection of Parsons and Reeb on Columbus's south side. It wasn't a glamorous address. The South Side was a working-class neighborhood. Factory workers, railroad men, immigrant families who counted every dollar twice before spending it. These were not people who shopped at department stores. Department stores were for someone else. That was exactly the point. Ephraim's model was built on a concept that sounds almost too simple. Close-out retail. He didn't sell new merchandise fresh from manufacturers. He bought the things that other retailers couldn't move. Overstock inventory, factory seconds, end-of-season merchandise, goods from stores that had gone under. He bought it cheap, priced it low, and moved it fast. His customers got brand-name goods at prices they had never seen before. He got volume, turnover, and loyalty. It was, at its core, a business built on other people's failures. And in early 20th century America, an economy prone to booms, busts, and the quiet bankruptcies of thousands of small merchants, there was never a shortage of raw material. Ephraim had 4 sons, Saul, Alvin, Leon, and Jerome, a daughter, Selma. Every one of them grew up working in that store on Parsons Avenue. The store wasn't just a business. It was a classroom, a training ground, a second home. By the time those children were old enough to make decisions, retail was in their blood. Jerome Schottenstein, the second generation, would be the one to turn a single store into a chain. He had his father's instinct for a deal and something Ephraim never needed: ambition at scale. Jerome understood that the close-out model wasn't limited to one corner of Columbus. It could work anywhere there were working-class families who wanted more than they could afford at full price. And in post-war America, a country exploding with suburban growth, consumer demand, and a middle class that was just beginning to define itself through what it bought, that market was everywhere. Through the 1950s and 1960s, Jerome expanded, store by store, city by city, always targeting the same customer. The family that wanted quality without the department store price tag. The chain grew slowly, deliberately, the way family businesses do when the people running them are spending their own money and sleeping with the consequences. By 1966, Jerome had acquired the Value City chain itself, absorbing it into the Schottenstein portfolio and giving the entire operation a name that said exactly what it was. Value City. Not aspirational, not glamorous, just honest. And then came the third generation. Jay Schottenstein was 40 years old in 1995 when he took full control of the family enterprise. By that point, the business had grown into something Ephraim Schottenstein could never have imagined from that corner lot on Parsons Avenue. A publicly traded chain with nearly 100 stores, close to $1 billion in annual revenue, and a reputation that Fortune magazine had just described as impermeable. Jay was aggressive, confident, and completely fluent in the language of modern retail. Under his leadership, Value City wouldn't just maintain what Jerome had built. It would expand, acquire, and push toward the kind of scale that turned regional chains into national institutions. What Jay didn't know, what no one in that building knew in 1995, was that the forces that would destroy everything were already in motion. They had been in motion for 30 years, and they were accelerating. But we're getting ahead of ourselves. In 1917, on a corner of Columbus's South Side, a Lithuanian immigrant opened a store and made a promise to his neighbors. Better living for less. For a long time, that promise was enough. By the late 1980s, Value City had stopped being a local story. 47 stores across the Midwest and Mid-Atlantic. $771 million in annual revenue in 1989. A distribution infrastructure built for scale. A buying operation that had turned the art of acquiring close-out merchandise into something closer to a science. Jerome Schottenstein's instinct had been proven right. The model worked everywhere, as long as you kept the promise. Brand name goods, deeply discounted, always in stock. The slogan said it plainly: better living for less. 4 words that captured exactly what Value City was selling. Not luxury, not aspiration, just the simple democratic idea that a factory worker in Columbus or a single mother in Baltimore deserved the same brands as anyone else, just without the department store markup. And then the 1990s arrived, and Value City didn't just survive. It thrived in a way that stunned the entire retail industry. The early 1990s were brutal for American retail. A recession hammered consumer spending. Department stores reported losses, mall traffic dropped. Chains that had expanded too aggressively in the 1980s were quietly closing locations and renegotiating leases. The retail landscape looked like a battlefield. Value City walked through it untouched. In 1992, while competitors were treading water, Value City reported same-store sales increases of 10%. 10% in a recession. Fortune magazine took notice and published what became the defining line of the chain's entire history. Value City seems impermeable to the soggy retailing climate. Impermeable. It was the kind of word that gets framed and hung on the wall of a corporate headquarters. And for a moment, it felt true. The logic was simple. When times are hard, discount retail wins. Customers who used to shop at full-price department stores start looking for alternatives. Value City was always there, waiting, with prices that made the decision easy. The worse the economy got, the better the customer traffic looked at 92,000 square foot stores stocked floor to ceiling with marked-down merchandise. In June 1991, the Schottenstein family took Value City public, offering a 25% stake to investors for the first time in the chain's history. The IPO raised $72.7 million, used primarily to reduce debt. A second stock offering before year's end raised another $21.4 million. The shares opened at $19 each. By 1992, they had climbed to $50, then split 2 for 1. Wall Street, it turned out, believed in the model as much as the customers did. By 1994, Value City's annual revenue had reached $864.9 million. The chain was on the doorstep of $1 billion. Jay Schottenstein had set that target publicly, and from where he stood in 1994, it looked inevitable. Just a matter of time and continued execution. Retail analyst R.L. Rotter that year called Value City the category killer of off-price and closeout retailing. Not a contender, not a strong regional player. The category killer, the dominant force in its space, and the space itself was growing. According to a report cited in Women's Wear Daily, off-price discounters had captured roughly 56% of the total U.S. apparel market between 1985 and 1991, translating to approximately $7 billion in sales. The trend was real, the market was massive, and Value City sat at the center of it. To keep pace with that growth, the Schottenstein family built new distribution centers in the early 1990s. Separate facilities for hard lines and soft lines, designed to support a chain that was heading toward 100 stores and beyond. They had plans to open new locations in the suburbs of Detroit, Chicago, and St. Louis. They were building the infrastructure of permanence, the kind of investment you make when you believe the story isn't ending anytime soon. The empire also expanded its reach through acquisition. In 1988, Value City purchased Filene's Basement, the legendary Boston-based bargain retailer that had been operating since 1909 and was famous for its automatic markdown system and its annual running of the bride's wedding gown sale. Filene's Basement was not a discount store in the Value City mold. It was an institution, a cultural landmark, a place that Bostonians talked about the way New Yorkers talked about certain delis or Chicagoans talked about certain pizza joints. Buying it gave Value City a foothold on the East Coast and a brand name that carried decades of goodwill. Then came DSW, Designer Shoe Warehouse, a concept built on the same principle as Value City, but applied exclusively to footwear. Brand name shoes at dramatically reduced prices, displayed in a warehouse format that let customers browse by size rather than by style. The format was intuitive, the prices were compelling, and shoppers responded. DSW would eventually become one of the most successful spin-offs in American retail history. But in the early 1990s, it was just another piece of the Value City portfolio, another proof point that the Schottenstein model could be applied to almost any product category. By 1995, Jay Schottenstein was at the controls of a retail operation with $1.2 billion in estimated total sales across all divisions: department stores, furniture, shoes. The family controlled more than 92% of the company's equity. They had survived the Depression. They had survived the post-war retail shakeout. They had survived the 1990s recession that crushed so many of their competitors. They had gone public, acquired institutions, built infrastructure, and expanded into new markets. From the inside, it felt like the beginning of something larger, like the foundation had been laid and the real building was just starting. From the outside, if you knew where to look, the cracks were already there. Here is something that gets lost in most retail collapse stories. The killing blow almost never comes from where you're looking. Value City spent decades watching its direct competitors, other off-price chains, regional department stores, close-out retailers working the same merchandise channels. They watched those businesses carefully, tracked their pricing, studied their buying strategies, and felt confident they were the best in their category. And they were right. In the world of close-out retail, nobody did it better than Value City. The problem was that the world had stopped caring about categories. In 1962, the same year John Glenn orbited the Earth and the first Walmart, Target, and Kmart stores simultaneously opened their doors. American retail entered a new era. It didn't announce itself. There were no headlines declaring the death of traditional retail. There was just a quiet proliferation of large, suburban, low-price stores offering something that no off-price retailer could match: consistency. Walk into a Walmart in 1975. Walk into that same Walmart in 1985. The same brands are on the shelves. The same categories are covered. The prices are low every single day, not because someone found a liquidation deal, but because the supply chain has been engineered to make low prices the permanent default. Sam Walton hadn't invented discounting. He had industrialized it. That distinction in between opportunistic discounting and systematic low pricing was the fault line that would eventually swallow Value City whole. But in the 1970s and 1980s, it wasn't obvious. Value City's customers weren't yet cross-shopping with Walmart on a weekly basis. The chains operated in overlapping but not identical spaces. Value City had brands that Walmart didn't carry. Value City had the thrill of the hunt. You never knew what you'd find, and that unpredictability was part of the appeal. But thrill of the hunt is a feature that works until it doesn't. And by the late 1980s, Walmart was no longer just a competitor. It was a force of nature. By 1989, Walmart operated over 1,400 stores across the United States. Its revenue that year was $25.8 billion, roughly 33 times Value City's total. It was building distribution infrastructure that made Value Cities look like a regional warehouse operation. It was negotiating directly with manufacturers at volumes that drove prices below anything a closeout buyer could achieve on liquidation merchandise. And it was expanding aggressively into the Midwest, directly into Value City's home territory. Then came Target's reinvention. Target had always been the more design-conscious sibling in the discount retail family. But in the mid-1990s, the chain made a deliberate, calculated pivot that the industry underestimated at the time. Target decided it wasn't just going to be cheap, it was going to be cheap and beautiful. Design partnerships with architects and fashion designers, store layouts that felt more like department stores than warehouses. A customer experience built around the idea that you shouldn't have to sacrifice style to save money. The tagline, "Expect more, pay less," it was a direct challenge to every discount retailer in America. It said, "We're not just competing on price, we're competing on everything. And if we win on everything, price alone is not enough to save you." For Value City, this was an existential problem it didn't yet fully understand. Its customer, the working-class family that wanted brands at low prices, was exactly the customer Target was now aggressively courting. And Target was offering something Value City couldn't: a consistent, curated, aesthetically pleasing shopping experience with reliable inventory and products that felt current, not leftover. The merchandise problem was structural and it was deep. Closeout retail depends entirely on what's available in the liquidation market at any given moment. Some weeks you have Levi's. Some weeks you have off-brand denim nobody wants. Some weeks your shoe section is full. Some weeks it's half empty. Customers who need a specific item, a winter coat in a specific size, a pair of work boots before Monday, cannot depend on Value City to have it. Walmart always has it. Target almost always has it. Value City might have it, or might have something close, or might have nothing useful at all. That inconsistency is not a management failure. It is the model. It is baked into the DNA of closeout retail. And for decades, it didn't matter because Value City's prices were low enough to compensate for the inconvenience. But as Walmart's prices dropped closer and closer to Value City's, powered by supply chain efficiencies that a closeout retailer could never replicate, the math started to change. Why drive to Value City and maybe find what you need when you can drive to Walmart and definitely find it for nearly the same price? The answer, increasingly, was there is no good reason. The first concrete sign that something was wrong came in 1997. Same-store sales growth, the single most important metric in retail, the number that tells you whether existing stores are getting better or worse, fell below 1% per month, not a temporary dip, a sustained grinding decline that lasted for months. Inventory piled up in back rooms. Buyers struggled to find merchandise that customers actually wanted at prices that made the economics work. The engine that had run so smoothly for so long was generating friction it couldn't explain. Jay Schottenstein had built an empire on his grandfather's instinct, but instinct had limits. And by late 1997, Value City needed something it had never needed before: a plan to survive a world that had changed around it. The family made a decision. They brought in someone from the outside. It was the first admission that the old playbook wasn't working. And in a family business built across 3 generations, that admission cost more than anyone said out loud. In late 1997, the Schottenstein family did something that family businesses almost never do willingly. They stepped aside. Jay Schottenstein, third-generation heir, chairman, the man whose name was synonymous with the entire operation, temporarily relinquished the CEO role. In his place, the board brought in Martin P. Doolin, a professional turnaround executive with no family ties to the business and no emotional attachment to the way things had always been done. Doolin came with a mandate: diagnose what was broken, fix what could be fixed, and stabilize the chain before the decline became irreversible. It was, in the language of corporate crisis management, a rational decision. It was also a signal to employees, to investors, to the retail industry watching from the outside that Value City's problems were serious enough to require outside intervention. You don't bring in a turnaround artist when things are going well. You bring one in when the people inside the building have run out of answers. Doolan moved quickly. He assembled a new executive team, replaced key positions in the buying organization, and went to work on the most visible symptom of the problem: inventory. The back rooms were stuffed with merchandise that wasn't moving. The buying process had become reactive rather than strategic, acquiring whatever was available in the closeout market rather than anticipating what customers actually wanted. Doolan tightened the buying operation, centralized decision-making, and pushed for sharper focus on the apparel categories that had historically driven traffic. The results in the short term were encouraging. By the late 1990s, Value City had stabilized. Same-store sales stopped their freefall. The inventory glut was worked down. A few quarters of acceptable performance gave the board enough confidence to believe the worst had passed. But stabilization is not recovery, and recovery is not transformation. What Doolan could fix, and did fix competently, were the operational inefficiencies that had accumulated over years of rapid expansion without adequate management discipline. What he could not fix was the fundamental question that no turnaround executive has the tools to answer. What do you do when your business model has an expiration date? Closeout retail in the late 1990s was not the same business it had been in the 1970s and 1980s. The supply of quality liquidation merchandise was changing. As major retailers got better at managing their own inventory, using data systems and supply chain technology that hadn't existed a decade earlier, the volume of desirable closeout goods flowing into the secondary market began to shrink. The best brands were managing their excess inventory more carefully, either selling it through their own outlet stores or destroying it rather than letting it reach discounters. What remained in the closeout market was increasingly the merchandise that nobody wanted: irregular sizes, discontinued styles, goods with subtle defects that customers noticed immediately. Value City's buying team was competing for a shrinking pool of quality product, and they were competing against more buyers, better capitalized, working the same channels. Meanwhile, the chain made a bet that looked bold at the time and looks catastrophic in retrospect: Feline's Basement. Value City had acquired the iconic Boston bargain retailer in 1988, but the full weight of operating it as a standalone chain became clear only in the late 1990s. Feline's Basement was a beloved institution, but it was a Boston institution, deeply rooted in a specific city's identity and retail culture. Scaling it nationally required capital, brand management expertise, and an understanding of urban retail dynamics that Value City, a Midwestern closeout chain, didn't fully possess. The famous Running of the Brides event was national news. The actual stores outside Boston struggled to generate the same loyalty. More importantly, Feline's Basement required a different kind of merchandise than Value City's core business. Its customers were not the same working-class families shopping Parsons Avenue in Columbus. They were urban professionals looking for designer brands at deep discounts, a customer who was increasingly well-served by a growing ecosystem of outlet malls, online discount sites, and the expanding off-price divisions of department store chains. Operating both Value City and Feline's Basement simultaneously meant managing two distinct customer bases, two distinct merchandise strategies, and two distinct real estate footprints, with a management team and capital structure that was already under strain. The acquisition that was supposed to expand Value City's reach instead divided its attention. By the early 2000s, Doolan had moved on. Jay Schottenstein returned to active leadership. The chain had survived the immediate crisis of the late 1990s, and on the surface, the numbers were acceptable. Value City entered the new decade with roughly 110 stores, a functioning distribution operation, and a brand that still carried real recognition among its core customers. But acceptable is a dangerous place to be. Acceptable means you're not declining fast enough to force radical change, but you're not growing fast enough to build the resources needed for transformation. Acceptable means you can keep doing what you're doing, right up until the moment you can't. The chain had been given a a brief, valuable window in which to reimagine itself, reposition its merchandise, and find a reason for its customers to choose Value City over the Walmart supercenter that was opening seemingly on every corner of every Midwestern suburb. That window was not used well, and by the middle of the decade, it was closing. There is a particular kind of corporate decline that doesn't make headlines. It doesn't have a single dramatic moment, a villain, or a date you can circle on a calendar. It happens in increments, a store here, a restructuring there, a quietly revised earnings forecast, a management shuffle that gets 3 paragraphs in the business section and is forgotten by the following week. From the outside, it looks like a company managing a difficult environment. From the inside, it feels like slow suffocation. That was Value City between 2001 and 2007. The early 2000s brought a new threat that made Walmart's expansion look almost manageable by comparison. Walmart introduced the supercenter format at massive scale, a single store combining a full-service grocery department with the general merchandise operation that had already been eating into Value City's customer base for 2 decades. The supercenter wasn't just a discount store, it was a destination. Families could buy groceries, clothing, housewares, electronics, and shoes in a single trip at prices that were now reliably competitive with anything Value City could offer on its best closeout days. The supercenter format spread through the Midwest with a speed that felt almost aggressive. Each new location that opened within driving distance of a Value City store didn't just compete for the same customers. It made Value City's value proposition harder to explain. Why make a separate trip to a store that might or might not have what you need when the supercenter 3 miles away definitely has everything, including your groceries? The customer traffic numbers told the story without ambiguity. Slowly, then less slowly, the working-class families who had been Value City's loyal base for decades began redirecting their shopping trips. Not all at once, not with any dramatic announcement. They just started going somewhere else, for reasons that made complete sense given the options available to them. Value City responded the way struggling retailers almost always respond. It kept doing what it had always done, only with less money to do it. The buying operation continued to source close-out merchandise, but with tighter budgets that made it harder to compete for the best available product. The store base, which required constant investment to maintain the kind of shopping environment that could compete with Target's relentlessly polished presentation, began to show its age. Fixtures that needed replacing stayed in place. Lighting that should have been updated wasn't. The stores that had felt like legitimate retail destinations in the 1990s began to feel, in the early 2000s, like they were falling behind. Not catastrophically, but visibly in the way that matters to customers making split-second decisions about where to spend an afternoon. Then came the acquisition strategy, the same strategy that had built the chain in the first place, now deployed as a survival mechanism rather than a growth engine. Value City had always grown by buying other retailers' failures. Jerome Schottenstein had built the business on it. Jay Schottenstein had continued it. But in the 2000s, each acquisition came with a price that the company could less and less afford to pay. Taking on distressed retail locations meant taking on distressed retail leases, distressed inventory, and the distressed reputations of chains whose customers had already decided to shop somewhere else. The math that had worked in the 1980s, buy cheap, rebrand, stock with close-out goods, watch the bargain-hungry customers arrive, was no longer reliable in a market saturated with low-price options. The acquisitions added stores to the count while subtracting momentum from the operation. Through the mid-2000s, the closures began in earnest. Not mass closures, not yet. Individual stores announced in brief press releases, attributed to lease expirations or market conditions or the kind of vague language that corporate communications departments use when the real explanation is too bleak to publish. Each closure was presented as a rational portfolio decision, and each one was. But the cumulative effect of rational individual decisions was an irrational collective outcome, a chain that was visibly, measurably shrinking, store by store, quarter by quarter, with no clear plan for what it was shrinking toward. In 2006, the closure that meant more than any of the others happened quietly, without ceremony. The store at 1887 Parsons Avenue in Columbus, the corner of Parsons and Reeb, the South Side location where Ephraim Schottenstein had opened the very first store in 1917, closed its doors. 89 years after the beginning, the place where it all started was gone. There was no commemoration, no retrospective in the local paper, just a darkened storefront on a South Side corner and a for-lease sign in the window. If anyone in the corporate offices saw the symbolism, they didn't say so publicly. By October 2007, Value City was operating 137 stores. The number itself was not alarming. It was close to the chain's historic peak. But the financial reality behind those stores was deeply unstable. That month, the company announced it was selling 24 locations to Burlington Coat Factory. This was not a strategic partnership or a market optimization. This was asset liquidation. The company was selling stores, real estate, fixtures, customer relationships, years of brand building in specific markets to raise cash and reduce a footprint it could no longer afford to maintain. 24 stores gone in a single transaction. The industry noticed, vendors noticed, landlords noticed, and most importantly, the company's lenders noticed. The credit terms that Value City depended on to finance its inventory, the short-term borrowing that allowed it to buy merchandise before it had been sold, began to tighten. Vendors who had extended generous payment terms for years started requiring faster settlement. Some stopped shipping altogether until outstanding balances were cleared. In the retail business, inventory is oxygen. When the supply of inventory tightens, the stores feel it immediately. Shelves that should be full aren't. Categories that customers expect to find are absent. The shopping experience deteriorates in ways that are hard to articulate but impossible to miss. Customers who come in looking for something and leave empty-handed don't always come back. And in 2007 and 2008, Value City's customers were leaving empty-handed with increasing frequency. In January 2008, the signal that the end was near arrived in the form of a corporate transaction. Retail Ventures Inc., the parent company that had held Value City since the Schottenstein family had restructured their retail holdings, announced it was selling its 81% ownership stake in Value City department stores to a newly formed entity called VCHI Acquisition Corp., assembled by a group of investment firms including Emerald Capital Management and Crystal Value. The Schottenstein family, in effect, was out. When the family that built a business across 3 generations sells its controlling interest to a consortium of outside investors, it is not a vote of confidence in the future. It is an exit. A quiet, structured, legally tidy exit, but an exit nonetheless. The people who knew this business better than anyone else on earth had decided that the risk of staying outweighed the possibility of recovery. 1 month later, in February 2008, Value City announced the closure of 30 more stores. 30 stores in a single announcement, the largest single contraction in the chain's history. The 113-store chain that had once been called the category killer of off-price retail was now down to 83 locations, then 75, then fewer still, as individual stores continued to close through the spring and summer without announcement. The employees who worked those stores experienced the decline in the most personal way possible, not as a line on a financial statement, but as a change in the texture of their daily working lives. Fewer hours on the schedule, shipments that didn't arrive when expected, managers who had been with the company for a decade quietly updating their resumes. The unspoken knowledge, shared between people who worked the floor and stocked the shelves and ran the registers, that something was ending, and that no one at corporate headquarters had a plan to stop it. Some of them had worked at Value City for 20 years. Some had parents who worked there before them. In Columbus in particular, the Schottenstein name had been part of the retail landscape for so long that its absence was difficult to imagine. These were not just jobs. They were, for many families, part of the story of how they had built their lives. By the fall of 2008, that story was almost over. 75 stores had closed in less than a year. The company's new owners were watching a business bleed cash at a rate that no operational adjustment could stop. The credit markets, already tightening before the September 2008 collapse of Lehman Brothers, were now frozen. Vendors had essentially stopped extending credit. The shelves were getting emptier by the week. There was one move left. By the third week of October 2008, the people running Value City department stores were not making retail decisions anymore. They were making legal ones. The country was in free fall. 3 weeks earlier, on September 15th, Lehman Brothers had filed the largest bankruptcy in American history, triggering a financial crisis that spread through the global economy with a speed that left policymakers, executives, and ordinary citizens alike scrambling for stable ground. The stock market was losing hundreds of points in single sessions. Consumer confidence had collapsed. And the credit markets, the financial plumbing that allowed businesses to borrow against future revenue in order to operate in the present, had essentially seized up. For a retailer like Value City, the timing could not have been worse. The fourth quarter, the period from October through December, was when discount retailers made the bulk of their annual revenue. Halloween merchandise, winter clothing, holiday gifts, the concentrated burst of consumer spending that every retailer spent the other 9 months of the year preparing for. To stock stores for the fourth quarter, Value City needed to borrow. To borrow, it needed lenders willing to extend credit against inventory. And in October 2008, those lenders had stopped picking up the phone. The vendors, the suppliers who had been shipping merchandise to Value City stores for years, had already tightened their terms months earlier as the chain's financial deterioration became impossible to ignore. By October, several had stopped shipping altogether. The stores that should have been filling up with holiday inventory were instead growing emptier by the week. Customers walked in, scanned shelves that were noticeably sparse, and walked out. Some didn't come back. The numbers filed with the bankruptcy court later told the story with brutal clarity. In the 6 months between February and August 2008, Value City had recorded a net loss of $70 million on $288.5 million in revenue. $70 million in losses in 6 months. No operational adjustment, no management change, no marketing campaign could close a gap that wide. The company was not declining. It was hemorrhaging. By the third week of October, the board had made its decision. There would be no restructuring, no last-minute capital injection, no white knight acquisition. There would be a Chapter 11 filing, a liquidation agreement, and an orderly wind-down of the remaining 66 stores. Tiger Capital Group was selected as the liquidator, the firm that would manage the going-out-of-business sales, price the remaining inventory for maximum recovery, and oversee the physical closure of every location. The paperwork was prepared over several days. Lawyers working in offices in New York drafted the documents that would be filed with the United States Bankruptcy Court for the Southern District of New York. A $40 million debtor-in-possession credit facility was negotiated with Wells Fargo and National City Business Credit. Money needed not to save the business, but to fund the process of closing it. Assets and liabilities were listed at between $100 million and $500 million. The number of creditors was estimated at between 10,000 and 25,000. On the evening of Saturday, October 25th, the documents were finalized. On Sunday morning, October 26th, they were reviewed for the last time. At some point before dawn on Monday, October 27th, they were filed. 91 years of American retail history reduced to a court filing on a Sunday night. Monday, October 27, 2008, early morning, in 66 stores across our 20 states, Ohio, Virginia, Pennsylvania, Maryland, Michigan, Georgia, Florida, and more, employees arrived for their opening shifts the same way they had arrived for thousands of shifts before. They pulled into parking lots, retrieved keys, deactivated alarms, turned on the lights, and began the routine that structured their working days. Some had done this for 5 years, some for 15, some for more than 20. At some point during those opening hours, they found the notice. It wasn't delivered in person by a manager. It wasn't announced in a company-wide meeting with leadership present to answer questions. In many stores, it was simply posted on a bulletin board or handed out as a printed sheet or communicated through a brief message from a district manager who had received the same information hours earlier and had no more answers than the people asking. The message was direct. Chapter 11, bankruptcy had been filed. All remaining stores would be liquidated. Going out of business sales would begin immediately. Employment would continue through the liquidation process, and then it would end. The reactions were not uniform because the people receiving the news were not uniform. There were employees who had seen it coming for months, the ones who had watched the shipments slow, watched the schedule hours shrink, watched the quiet parade of managers leaving for other jobs. These employees had updated their resumes in August. Some had already accepted positions elsewhere. For them, the notice was confirmation, not surprise. The relief of finally knowing was mixed with the sadness of watching something end that had been a significant part of their lives. There were employees who had convinced themselves it wouldn't happen. Retail chains always looked like they were in trouble, and then they restructured, brought in new management, found a buyer. Someone always came in at the last minute. These employees stood in break rooms and in stock rooms, reading the notice, and felt something closer to disbelief than grief. The specific shock of an outcome you knew was possible, but never fully accepted as real. And then there were the employees who had worked at Value City, or Schottenstein's, as it had been known for most of its history in Columbus, for so long that the store was not separable from their professional identity. People who had started on the floor as teenagers and worked their way into management. People whose parents had shopped there, whose children had come in on weekends. In Columbus especially, where the Schottenstein name had been part of the city's retail landscape since 1917, the closure wasn't just a job loss. It was the end of something that had felt, for a very long time, like a permanent feature of the city itself. These employees didn't have words for what they felt. They went back to work because there was still work to do. The liquidation sales began within days. Tiger Capital moved quickly, marking down merchandise, reconfiguring store layouts to concentrate remaining inventory, installing the bright yellow going out of business signage that transforms a retail location into something between a clearance event and a funeral. The sales drew crowds, they always do. There is something about a going out of business sale that activates a particular kind of consumer urgency. The sense that if you don't come now, the opportunity will be gone. And this time, it was true. The stores that had struggled for months to attract customers were suddenly full. People who hadn't shopped at Value City in years came back one last time, pushing carts through aisles they remembered from childhood, picking up discounted merchandise with the slightly dazed energy of people who aren't sure whether they're bargain hunting or paying their respects. In Columbus, the two remaining stores drew customers who came as much to witness as to shop. Some of them remembered when the stores were called Schottenstein's. Some of them had parents who had bought their school clothes here in the 1970s. Some of them were buying the last remaining inventory at 50% off and feeling guilty about it in a way they couldn't quite explain. The liquidation process ran through November and into December. Each week, the discounts deepened. The shelves emptied. The fixtures were tagged for sale. The signage came down from the walls. The stores that had taken years to build were being systematically disassembled in a matter of weeks, with a thoroughness and efficiency that was almost admirable if you didn't think too hard about what it meant. On December 23, 2008, 2 days before Christmas, the last Value City stores completed their final transactions. Registers were closed. Remaining fixtures and equipment were cataloged for auction. Employees who had worked through the liquidation received their final paychecks. The lights went off. The doors were locked from the outside. 91 years after Ephraim Schottenstein opened a store on the south side of Columbus for people who couldn't afford full price, the last Value City closed 2 days before the holiday that the entire retail industry exists to serve. The timing was not symbolic. It was just the math of liquidation schedules and lease terminations, but it felt symbolic anyway. Every corporate collapse has an official narrative. The bankruptcy filing, the press release, the analyst commentary, the postmortem in the business press. That narrative deals in numbers and structures and strategic errors. The language of institutions talking about themselves in the third person. But inside every one of those institutions are people for whom the collapse is not a narrative. It is a Tuesday morning. It is a phone call you have to make to your spouse. It is the specific, unglamorous experience of watching something you built your working life around come apart in front of you and having to figure out what comes next. Value City's story had thousands of those people. Their experiences didn't make the business press. They didn't get quoted in the bankruptcy filings, but they are the actual texture of what happened, the human reality beneath the institutional one. Three of those stories in particular capture something true about how a collapse like this lands on the people inside it. The first is the story of the long-timer. Picture a woman, call her Sandra, who started working the floor at a Schottenstein store in Columbus in the early 1980s, when she was 19 years old and needed a job that fit around her class schedule at Columbus State. She expected to stay for a semester. She stayed for 25 years. She watched the rebranding from Schottenstein's to Value City. She watched the IPO and the excitement that came with it, the sense that the chain was becoming something larger, something with a future that justified the loyalty of the people who had been there from the beginning. She worked her way from the floor to department supervisor to assistant store manager. She knew the merchandise. She knew the customers. She knew by name the regulars who came in every week and the seasonal shoppers who showed up in October looking for winter coats. By 2005, she knew something else. She had watched enough retail to recognize the pattern. The tightening budgets, the merchandise quality slipping, the district managers who came in quarterly with increasingly grim faces and increasingly vague reassurances. She had watched two of her best floor supervisors leave for Target and Kohl's, and she had watched the company fail to replace them with anyone comparable, because the pay scales had been quietly reduced to a level that made Value City a difficult sell to anyone with options. She didn't leave, not because she couldn't. She had the experience and the references to find work elsewhere. She stayed because she had been there for 25 years, and leaving felt like a betrayal of something she couldn't fully articulate. The store was part of who she was. The customers were people she knew. The work itself, the physical, concrete work of running a retail floor, managing people, solving the daily problems that never stopped coming, was work she was genuinely good at and genuinely valued. When the notice came in October 2008, she read it twice. Then she went back to work because there were customers in the store and the floor still needed managing. She worked through the liquidation all the way to December 23rd. She was one of the last people to leave on the final day. The severance was modest. The job search took 8 months. She eventually found a management position at a regional grocery chain. Steady work, decent pay, a company that appeared to be on stable ground. She was good at it. She never worked in retail clothing again. The second story is the story of the one who left before the end. David, a district manager who had overseen a cluster of Value City stores in the Mid-Atlantic region, had been reading the internal numbers since 2006, and what he read scared him. District managers see things that corporate communications departments don't publish. They see the week-over-week traffic counts, the shrinkage reports, the vendor relationship status updates, the turnover numbers for store-level employees. They sit in regional meetings where the optimistic framing of the quarterly presentation doesn't quite match the operational reality being described by the people running actual stores. They learn, over time, to translate corporate language into what it actually means. By early 2007, David had done that translation and arrived at a conclusion he didn't share with anyone at corporate. The chain was not going to make it. Not in its current form, not with its current merchandise strategy, not against the competitive environment it was operating in. The timeline was unclear. It could be 2 years, it could be 4, but the direction was not. He spent 6 months preparing, quietly updating his network, reaching out to former colleagues who had moved to other retailers, positioning himself for a transition that he hoped he was wrong about but couldn't assume he was. In September 2007, he accepted a position with a regional department store chain at a modest pay cut. He left Value City with a letter of thanks from his regional VP and a small farewell gathering at a Columbus restaurant. 14 months later, the chain filed for bankruptcy. David watched from the outside with the particular mixture of vindication and sadness that comes from being right about something you genuinely wished you'd been wrong about. The people he had managed, the store managers and floor supervisors and stockroom workers in his former district, sent him messages in the days after the announcement. Some asked if he knew of any openings. Some just wanted to tell someone who had been there that they were angry or scared or both. He helped as many of them as he could. The third story is the shortest and in some ways the most revealing. Margaret had shopped at Value City and before that at Schottenstein's for 30 years. She was not an employee. She was a customer, a loyal, consistent, twice-a-month customer who bought her children's school clothes there every August, her own work clothes there in the spring, and her husband's holiday gifts there in November. She had a system built over decades of knowing the store's rhythms and merchandise patterns. She knew which weeks the good shipments came in. She knew which departments to check first. She knew the layout of her local store the way she knew the layout of her own kitchen. By 2006, she had started noticing the changes. The shipments that used to reliably include name brands were now hit or miss. Categories that used to be fully stocked were sometimes half empty. The store felt, incrementally, less worth the trip. Not bad enough to stop going entirely, but diminished in a way that quietly eroded the habit. By 2007, she was going once a month instead of twice. By early 2008, she was going a few times a year. She had started shopping at Walmart for basics and Target for clothing. The transition happened so gradually that she didn't think of it as a decision. It was just what made sense, given what each store was offering. When Value City filed for bankruptcy in October 2008, she felt a genuine pang of loss, the specific nostalgia for a place that had been a reliable presence in her life for 3 decades. She went to the going out of business sale and bought a winter coat at 60% off. Then she drove to Walmart for groceries on the way home. She didn't think of it as ironic. It was just where things were now. Those 3 stories: the long-timer who stayed until the lights went out, the manager who saw it coming and made his exit, and the customer who drifted away without ever making a conscious decision to leave, are not unusual. They are, in one form or another, the story of every person connected to Value City in its final years. They are also, in one form or another, the story of every retail chain that has ever lost the argument with a changing market. The institution collapses, the people adapt. Life continues in a different shape than before. The adaptation is never as clean as that sentence makes it sound. When a retail chain closes, the physical evidence disappears faster than you expect. The signage comes down within weeks. The fixtures are auctioned off, shelving units and clothing racks and display cases that end up in other stores, other warehouses, other businesses that have no connection to the one that just failed. The lease spaces get reassigned eventually to new tenants. A gym moves in where the shoe department used to be. A discount grocery occupies a footprint where housewares were stacked to the ceiling. The parking lot gets repainted. The facade gets a new sign. Within a year, the physical presence of a chain that operated for 91 years can be almost entirely erased from the built environment. The stores are gone. What remains is the aftermath, the financial, human, and institutional consequences that don't get erased as quickly as the signage. In Value City's case, the aftermath was complicated because the collapse of the department store chain was not the end of the Schottenstein story. It was not even, strictly speaking, the end of Value City as a name in American retail. What died in December 2008 was one specific business, the close-out department store chain that Ephraim Schottenstein had started on Parsons Avenue. What survived was messier, more fragmented, and in some cases more successful than the original. The most striking piece of the aftermath was DSW. Designer Shoe Warehouse had been born inside the Value City portfolio, a concept developed by the Schottenstein organization in the late 1980s and early 1990s, applying the off-price model specifically to footwear. By the time Value City was collapsing, DSW had already been separated from the department store operation, operating as a publicly traded company under the Retail Ventures umbrella. It was not part of the bankruptcy filing. It was not liquidated. It did not close. In fact, DSW did the opposite. While Value City was dying, DSW was growing, expanding its store count, refining its merchandising, and building the kind of brand recognition that Value City had spent decades trying to maintain and eventually lost. The warehouse format worked. The merchandise, brand name shoes at significant discounts, displayed in a self-service environment that let customers shop efficiently, solved the consistency problem that had plagued Value City's general merchandise operation. DSW always had shoes, good shoes, recognizable shoes, in a wide range of sizes and styles. Customers could depend on it. DSW eventually became Designer Brands Inc., a publicly traded company operating hundreds of stores across the United States and Canada. Its largest unsecured claim in the Value City bankruptcy, approximately $4.5 million, was a footnote in a court filing. The business itself had long since moved beyond any dependence on its origins. The child had outlived the parent by decades, and the child was thriving. Feline's Basement followed a different trajectory, one that was almost a mirror image of Value City's own decline, compressed into a shorter timeline. After being separated from Value City's operations, Feline's Basement filed for Chapter 11 bankruptcy in August 2009. Less than a year after Value City's own collapse, the chain was purchased out of bankruptcy by Sims Corp in Osh, a menswear retailer, which attempted to operate it as a going concern. The attempt failed. In November 2011, both Sims Corp Darcer and Feline's Basement filed for bankruptcy simultaneously. This time, there was no buyer. The remaining stores closed. The liquidation was completed by early 2012. The institution that Edward Feline had founded in Boston in 1909, the store that had pioneered automatic markdowns, that had run the Running of the Brides event for decades, that had become a genuine cultural landmark in New England, ended not with a single collapse, but with two, spread across 3 years. Each time it seemed like someone had found a way to save it, the underlying economics reasserted themselves. The off-price retail space that Feline's Basement had helped create was now crowded with better capitalized competitors who had built more modern operations around the same basic premise. The brand survives today as an online retailer, a website selling discounted merchandise under the Feline's Basement name, operated by a company with no physical stores and no connection to the Boston original beyond the trademark. It is the kind of afterlife that retail brands sometimes find in the internet era. Technically alive, practically unrecognizable. Value City Furniture, meanwhile, had never been part of the department store operation in the way that outsiders sometimes assumed. The furniture chain had been formally separated from the Schottenstein department store business in the mid-1990s, when Jay Schottenstein's cousin developed the American Signature proprietary furniture brand and built it into the centerpiece of a standalone retail concept. By the time Value City department stores filed for bankruptcy, Value City Furniture was an entirely separate entity with its own management, its own real estate footprint, and its own customer base. It survived. It continued to expand. Today, it operates more than 130 stores across the eastern United States, selling furniture and home furnishings under the Value City Furniture and American Signature names. The connection to the department store chain that shared its name is rarely mentioned in its marketing. Most of its current customers have no memory of the department stores at all. The name lived on. The business it was attached to did not. The physical real estate left by Value City's closure presented a challenge that played out across dozens of Midwestern and Mid-Atlantic communities over the years that followed. The average Value City store occupied approximately 92,000 square feet, a substantial anchor-sized space in the strip malls and power centers where most of the chain's locations had been situated. 66 stores closing simultaneously meant roughly 6 million square feet of retail space returning to the market in a single wave, at a moment when the broader retail environment was contracting and demand for large format retail space was declining. Some of those spaces found new tenants relatively quickly: discount grocers, fitness chains, the kind of value-oriented retailers that thrive in post-recession environments. Others sat vacant for years, their empty parking lots and darkened storefronts becoming familiar features of neighborhoods that had already been struggling before the closure. The landlords who held those leases absorbed losses that didn't make national news, but were felt acutely at the local level, in property tax bases, in adjacent retail traffic, in the slow deterioration of commercial corridors that depend on anchor tenants to function. In Columbus, the closures had a particular resonance. The city had grown up, in some sense, alongside the Schottenstein retail operation. The Southside neighborhood where Ephraim had opened his first store in 1917 had changed enormously over the decades. Demographics shifted, industries came and went. The physical fabric of the neighborhood was transformed multiple times over. But the Schottenstein presence had been a constant, a thread of commercial continuity that connected the city's working-class past to its retail present. When that thread was cut, the absence was felt not just as a commercial vacancy, but as something harder to name. The loss of a landmark that people hadn't thought to value until it was gone. The Schottenstein family itself continued. Jay Schottenstein, who had led the family's retail operations through both its peak and its collapse, did not disappear from American business after 2008. The family's broader portfolio, real estate holdings, investment interests, the furniture and home furnishings operations, remained intact. Schottenstein Stores Corporation, the private holding company that had always sat above the various retail operations, continued to function. The family also maintained connections to American Eagle Outfitters, the apparel chain that had been part of the Schottenstein portfolio before being sold to the public in 1994, and in which family members retained involvement through various channels. American Eagle, which had struggled badly in the early 1990s under Schottenstein ownership before its turnaround, had become by the 2000s one of the more successful specialty apparel retailers in the country. The business that had failed was one branch of a larger tree. The tree was still standing, but the branch that had started in 1917 on a corner of Columbus's south side with a Lithuanian immigrant and a straightforward promise, better living for less, that branch was gone. And the people who had depended on it in one way or another had to find their way without it. That is always how it ends, not with a clean conclusion, but with a dispersal of people, of assets, of the accumulated energy of a business that existed for a long time and then didn't. The institution dissolves, the consequences persist, and somewhere in the dispersal, the lessons wait to be found by whoever is paying attention. When a business fails, the official explanation is almost never the real one. The official explanation for Value City's collapse was the 2008 financial crisis, the frozen credit markets, the tightening vendor terms, the collapse in consumer spending that followed Lehman Brothers. These were real factors. They were cited in the bankruptcy filing, repeated in the press coverage, and accepted by most observers as the proximate cause of the chain's demise. But proximate cause is not the same as root cause. The financial crisis of 2008 did not kill Value City. It was the last push given to something that was already falling. The chain had been structurally compromised for more than a decade before October 2008. The crisis simply removed the last remaining supports and let gravity finish the job. To understand what actually happened, and more importantly, what it means, you have to go back further than 2008. You have to go back to the question at the center of Value City's entire existence. What is the value of a discount when discounts are everywhere? The closeout retail model that Ephraim Schottenstein built in 1917 was predicated on a specific inefficiency in the American retail market. Manufacturers and retailers in the early 20th century had no reliable mechanism for managing excess inventory. They produced goods. Those goods moved through supply chains with limited visibility, and at the end of a season or a production run, there was always a surplus. Merchandise that the market hadn't absorbed at full price, that needed to move quickly, that someone needed to buy cheaply and sell at a discount. Ephraim was that someone. He built a business on being the buyer of last resort, the person willing to take the merchandise that nobody else wanted, price it low enough to move, and find the customers who needed quality goods at prices they could afford. The model was elegant precisely because it was built on a structural feature of the market, not a temporary opportunity. As long as manufacturers overproduced and retailers misforecast demand, there would always be closeout merchandise. And as long as there was closeout merchandise, there would always be a Value City. What the model could not survive was the elimination of the inefficiency it depended on. Beginning in the 1980s and accelerating through the 1990s, the American retail industry underwent a technological transformation that fundamentally changed the economics of inventory management. Point-of-sale data systems allowed retailers to track what was selling in real time. Supply chain software allowed manufacturers to adjust production runs based on actual demand rather than forecasts. Just-in-time inventory management reduced the surpluses that had once been the lifeblood of the closeout business. The information that had once been unavailable, exactly how many units of a particular item were selling, in which stores, in which sizes, at which price points, was suddenly available, and the entire industry reorganized itself around it. The result was a gradual but relentless decline in the quality and volume of available closeout merchandise. The best brands were no longer generating the surpluses they once had. When they did have excess inventory, they were increasingly managing it through their own outlet stores rather than selling it to third-party discounters. The secondary merchandise market, the market that Value City depended on for its entire inventory, was becoming shallower, more competitive, and less reliable as a source of the brand name goods that had built the chain's reputation. This was not a crisis that announced itself. It was a slow erosion, visible only in aggregate, over years. The buying team at Value City knew the merchandise was getting harder to source. They knew the quality was less consistent than it had been a decade earlier. But the institutional response, buy more aggressively, accept lower quality goods, expand the definition of what Value City would carry, made the problem worse rather than better. A store that used to reliably have Levi's and Nike was now carrying brands that customers didn't recognize, at prices that weren't dramatically different from what Walmart was charging for the same tier of merchandise. The value proposition was eroding from both ends simultaneously. The merchandise was getting worse. The competition was getting better. Walmart's role in Value City's death is both simpler and more profound than it's usually described. The common narrative is that Walmart undercut Value City on price and stole its customers. This is true, but it misses the more important mechanism. Walmart didn't just offer lower prices. Walmart offered lower prices with consistency. The same brands, the same categories, reliably in stock, in every store, every day. Walmart had industrialized the one thing that closeout retail could never provide: predictability. When a Value City customer needed a winter coat in a size 16, they might find exactly what they wanted, or they might find nothing useful at all. The same customer at Walmart would find coats. Maybe not the exact brand they preferred, maybe not in every color, but coats, in their size at a low price, without any uncertainty about whether the trip was worth making. That reliability, that elimination of the shopping trip as a gamble, was worth more to most customers than the occasional great find at Value City. And as Walmart's prices converged toward Value Cities through the 1990s and 2000s, the calculus became impossible to argue against. The expected value of a trip to Walmart was simply higher than the expected value of a trip to Value City, every time. Target added a dimension that was even harder for Value City to address: aspiration. Target figured out that working class and middle class consumers didn't just want low prices. They wanted to feel good about where they shopped. They wanted a store that felt clean and current and designed with some consideration for the people walking through it. They wanted merchandise that looked like it belonged in the present, not like it had been rescued from somewhere else's past. Value City's entire aesthetic, the warehouse-style presentation, the inconsistent merchandise, the implicit message that these goods were here because they hadn't sold somewhere else first, worked against the aspiration that Target was selling so effectively. And aspirational retail, it turned out, was something that customers at every income level were willing to pay a small premium for. 3 structural lessons emerged from Value City's collapse that are worth stating directly because they apply to every business built on a competitive advantage that it assumes is permanent. The first, a price advantage without a consistency advantage, is not a durable business model. Value City could beat Walmart on price on any given item, on any given day. It could not beat Walmart on the reliability of having that item available. In the long run, consistency won. It almost always does because customers make decisions based on expected outcomes, not best-case scenarios. The second, acquisition as a growth strategy and acquisition as a survival strategy are fundamentally different things, and confusing them is fatal. The Schottenstein family had built Value City by buying other retailers' failures and turning them into Value City stores. That strategy worked when the chain was growing because it added scale and geographic reach at low cost. It failed when the chain was declining because each acquisition added obligations, leases, inventory, personnel, without adding the one thing the chain actually needed: a reason for customers to choose it over better capitalized competitors. By the 2000s, Value City was acquiring distressed assets not because it saw opportunity, but because it had no other growth mechanism. That is the moment when a strategy becomes a crutch. The third and most important, when the founding family exits, the story is over. Not always immediately, not always visibly, but the January 2008 sale of Retail Ventures' 81% stake in Value City to outside investors was not a restructuring, it was a verdict. The people who had built this business across 3 generations, who understood it better than anyone alive, who had every financial and emotional incentive to believe in its recovery, those people had looked at the available evidence and decided the risk of staying was greater than the cost of leaving. When the people with the most information and the most at stake make that decision, the outside observer should pay attention. They are telling you something that the press releases are not. The deeper truth about Value City is this. It did not fail because it was badly managed, or because it made a single catastrophic decision, or because the 2008 financial crisis arrived at an inconvenient moment. It failed because the world it was built for, a world of retail inefficiency, abundant close-out merchandise, and customers with no better low-price option, had quietly ceased to exist. And the business, for all its history and scale and family loyalty, could not remake itself into something suited to the world that replaced it. That is not a story about retail. It is a story about the half-life of competitive advantage. Every business is built on some version of the same bet. We can do something better than anyone else, and that advantage will last long enough to build something permanent around it. Sometimes the advantage does last. Sometimes it lasts long enough to build 3 generations of a family dynasty and nearly $1 billion in annual revenue. And sometimes the market changes around you while you're looking in the wrong direction, and the thing you built, however solid it felt, turns out to have been standing on ground that was moving the whole time. Value City's ground started moving in 1962, the year Walmart opened its first store. It took 46 years to fall. There is a corner in Columbus, Ohio, that most people drive past without thinking about it. Parsons Avenue and Reeb Avenue on the city's south side. A working-class neighborhood that has changed many times over the past century. The demographics shifted. The industries that sustained it came and went. The physical fabric of the streets was rebuilt and rebuilt again. It is not a corner that appears in travel guides or city brochures. It is not a landmark that Columbus promotes to visitors. But in 1917, a Lithuanian immigrant named Ephraim Schottenstein stood on that corner and opened a store. And what he started there, the idea, the model, the promise, grew into something that touched the lives of hundreds of thousands of people across 20 states over the course of 91 years. The store at 1887 Parsons Avenue closed in 2006, 2 years before the bankruptcy, 2 years before the end. It closed quietly, the way most things end in retail. A lease expiration, a business decision, a brief notice in the local paper if it merited one at all. The building is still there. The corner is still there. But the store is gone, and has been gone long enough now that most people passing it have no memory of what it once was. That is how endings actually work. Not with a final scene that ties everything together, but with a gradual fading. One light going out, then another, until the darkness is complete and ordinary and no longer remarkable to anyone except the people who remember the light. Value City department stores operated for 91 years. It survived the Great Depression, when the economy contracted by a third and thousands of American businesses disappeared. It survived the Second World War, when consumer goods were rationed and retail was transformed by the pressures of a wartime economy. It survived the stagflation of the 1970s, the savings and loan crisis of the late 1980s, the recession of the early 1990s that Fortune magazine noted it walked through almost untouched. It did not survive Walmart. It did not survive Target. It did not survive the quiet, decades-long transformation of the American retail market from a landscape of regional players and local institutions into a consolidated oligopoly dominated by a handful of national chains with supply chains, technology, and capital resources that no close-out retailer could match. This is not a story about bad management or poor decisions, though there were both. It is not a story about a financial crisis arriving at the wrong moment, though the timing was brutal. It is a story about a business that was exquisitely well suited to the world that existed when it was built, and that could not adapt quickly enough to the world that replaced it. Ephraim Schottenstein's insight that there was a market for quality goods at discount prices, that working-class families deserved access to brands they couldn't afford at full price, was not wrong. It was exactly right. It was right for decades. It generated nearly $1 billion in annual revenue and employed tens of thousands of people and gave 3 generations of a family dynasty a reason to come to work every day. The insight just had an expiration date, and the expiration date arrived before anyone was ready. The people who worked at Value City, the floor associates and department supervisors and store managers and district managers and buyers and warehouse workers, moved on the way people do. Some found work in retail, some left the industry entirely. Some built careers at the chains that had contributed to Value City's decline. At Walmart, at Target, at the discount retailers that inherited the customers and the market share that Value City left behind. The customers moved on, too. The families who had bought their school clothes and holiday gifts and housewares at Value City for decades redirected those shopping trips to other stores. The transition was seamless in the way that market transitions always are. Not a single dramatic moment of switching allegiance, but a gradual reorientation that happened so naturally it felt like nothing at all. The merchandise that had filled Value City's shelves was sold off at liquidation prices in December 2008. The fixtures were auctioned. The leases were returned to landlords. The distribution centers in Columbus and Virginia were vacated. The corporate offices closed. The legal entity that had operated under the Value City name was dissolved. 91 years unwound in a matter of months. DSW is still open. Value City Furniture is still open. The Schottenstein family is still in business, in various forms, across various industries. The broader story continued, but the specific story, the one that started on that South Side corner in 1917 with a traveling salesman and a simple idea, that story ended on December 23, 2008, when the last registers closed and the last employees walked out and the last doors were locked from the outside. 2 days before Christmas, in the city where it began, there is a question worth sitting with as this story ends. Value City is not unique. It is not even unusual. The history of American retail is a history of businesses that dominated their moment and then lost the argument with a changing market. A&P, Kmart, Sears, Woolworths, Montgomery Ward, Circuit City, Toys R Us. Chains that were, at their peaks, as formidable and as permanent seeming as Value City ever was. Chains whose collapse in retrospect looks inevitable, and whose leaders at the time had every reason to believe they were building something that would last. The pattern repeats because the underlying dynamic never changes. Competitive advantages erode. Markets evolve. The customers who were loyal to a brand will redirect that loyalty without guilt and without ceremony the moment a better option presents itself. And the better option always presents itself, eventually, to every business in every industry. The question is not whether the ground will shift. It always does. The question is whether the people running the business are watching the ground or watching the competition they already know, while something they haven't considered yet is changing everything beneath their feet. Value City watched its direct competitors carefully. It watched other off-price chains, other close-out retailers, other regional department stores. It did not watch carefully enough the systemic transformation of the American retail market that was happening at a level far below the category it defined itself as operating in. By the time the shift was undeniable, the distance to close was too great. On the corner of Parsons Avenue and Reeb Avenue, on the south side of Columbus, Ohio, the building is still there. It has had other tenants since 2006. It will probably have others still. The corner doesn't know what happened there. It doesn't remember Ephraim Schottenstein or Jerome or Jay. It doesn't remember the workers who spent their careers inside those walls or the customers who came in looking for something they could afford and left with something better than they expected. The corner is just a corner. The city moves around it. But for 91 years, something real was built on that ground. Something that started with one person's belief that ordinary people deserved better than they could afford, and that lasted long enough to prove, at massive scale, that the belief was right. That it ended is not the most important thing about it. That it existed for as long as it did, for the people it served, that is the thing worth remembering. The lights went out on December 23rd, 2008. The shelves were empty. The signs came down. And in Columbus, Ohio, the city that started it all, the corner of Parsons and Reeb sat quiet in the winter dark, the way it had sat before any of this began, as if waiting for the next person with a simple idea and somewhere to put it.